Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Welcome to the final week in our Christmas series, God With Us. My name is Dan. I'm one of the pastors here, and our hope throughout this series has been to show you how this truth, God with us, changes your life on a daily basis. The first week, we talked about how God is with us when we fall short. Then we talked about how God is with us when we feel the pressure and when we are lonely. And in each case, the reality of God's nearness changes our experience in life. And when we understand that God is with us when we fall short, we run to Him and find that He restores us. And we realize that God is with us when we feel the pressure, we move toward Him instead of toward other things and find that He alone satisfies. And when we find out that God is with us when we're lonely, we realize we're never, ever alone. And my hope today, whether you're joining us online in Dixon City or in Wilkes-Barre, my hope is that you will experience God's closeness for yourself this Christmas. In our time together today, we're gonna look at one last place in our lives when we feel like God is not with us. And it's those times when we're searching. See, there's seasons in our lives when we're searching for a way through some tough circumstances. When we're searching for some help and some hope in the everyday grind of life. It's kind of like you see here on our intensity meter of life. There are times in life that are full of bliss. There are times when your heart is full to overflowing. You cannot imagine life being any better. For some of the women in the room, this is your wedding day. For some of the men, this was your honeymoon. Bliss. You can't imagine life being any better. There's also happiness in life. Those are the seasons when what you've worked for and what you've hoped for actually happens. You get on the team, you get the promotion, you get the scholarship, you found someone special. These are the happy times. Then on the other side of the meter is what we'd call tragedy. It's when what you're most afraid of happens. It's the overdose or the suicide or the freak accident or the divorce. This is crisis. This is when an unexpected trial comes into your life. It's not the worst thing that could happen, but it is a hard thing to face. Maybe your child is hurting and you went to family night and you found some help, and so you think you found a way out, and so it's gonna be hard, but you got some next steps. That's a crisis. Or you lose your job and you don't know how you're gonna make ends meet, and so you kind of sit down and you make a plan and you say your prayers and you start filling out some applications, and that's a crisis, but you'll make it through. You see, these different seasons of our lives, we can dip more towards happy or more towards less than happy. But for most of us, most of the time, the reality is we spend most of our time here in the middle, in this middle section, ranging from mid-frustration to general satisfaction, but mostly, just living life. Busy and stressful and sometimes unclear, often full of questions. That's the middle of our intensity meter. It's like when you've been dealing with extended family conflict for a long time. It doesn't seem like it's going away, and it's kind of built up to a certain level that you think, do I need to say something? Do we need to have a conversation? Do I need to pull back from some of these relationships? How do I get out of, how do I solve this situation? And, that's just life. Or you're a student and you're nearing the end of high school and you're thinking, man, I got some decisions to make. Is it college for me? Is it trade school? Is it a career? What direction should I go? And you're just in the middle here trying to figure it out, and that's just life. Or maybe your job's a total grind and you hate going to work and you've been there for a number of years, and so you've built up some expertise in this area, but you'd rather bail and leave, but you're thinking, is that stupid after all the skill and expertise that I've developed? Should I leave or should I stay? Is it gonna be like this until I retire and this is just life for you? So here we are in the normal in-between of life. And it is in this area, in the normal in-between, that we are often searching and searching hard. Searching for something that works, I'd call that a solution. or searching for the right way to go, I'd call that direction, or searching for the end of some persistent problem that just won't go away, I'll call that resolution. And if we don't find what we're searching for, we end up leading what Thoreau called lives of quiet desperation, feeling stuck, searching but not finding, frustrated that we can't seem to make life work. And this is a widespread experience because this is where most of us live most of the time. Now, when people look up Bible verses online, they typically go to one of two places, either Bible Gateway or the YouVersion app and website. And so these websites and apps, they make it possible for people to find verses that are going to help get them through life. And at the end of the year, every year, these two sources, they reveal the top verses that people wanted to find. These are hundreds and millions of people, 100 millions of people who are using these platforms to find passages. And in 2018, the verse that was highlighted, bookmarked, and shared more than any other on YouVersion was Isaiah 41:10, which says, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." That's like God saying, I'm with you, I've got this, and I will get you through. The most read Bible verse on Bible Gateway was Jeremiah 29:11, where it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." That's like God saying, I'm with you, I've got this, I'm gonna get you through. In our normal everyday lives full of this low-grade frustration and sometimes satisfaction and waffling back and forth between the two, we are searching for solutions, for direction, for resolutions. We're searching for a trustworthy strategy to guide us through what's just life. And today we're going to talk about what to do when you find yourself in a season of searching, and how knowing that God is with you gives you peace, and it gives you confidence, and it gives you purpose on the journey. And if I can encapsulate everything that I'm going to say in one sentence that you can return to again and again when you're searching, it is this: God's got this. Even when I can't see how, God's got this. And even when I don't know what to do next, God's got this. And even when nothing has changed after a long time, God's got this. And so we're going to look at Psalm 25 in the Bible together. You can get there in your Bible or Bible app. And what we're going to discover are three realities that prove that God's got this. And if we will turn to him with our frustration, he can turn our frustration into confidence and purpose and peace. Now, the Psalms, they were written as worship songs for the Hebrews. 150 pieces of poetry that you could quote or sing. And because the Psalms cover the whole gamut of human experience, from all the way from bliss to tragedy and everything in between, because it covers all of life, the Psalms taught those who read them and sang them, it taught them how to walk with God in every circumstance of life. And one of the things I appreciate most about the Psalms is how raw and honest they are about the life of faith. It's like we get to peek inside of their journals, and we see them questioning God and wrestling with God and praising God even when they don't get it. The psalm we're going to look at together, Psalm 25, was written by David. And we don't know the exact circumstances he was in when he wrote this psalm, but what we do know is that this psalm is the result of a long season without resolution. When he was feeling that frustration building up, when he was feeling like life was not working out and he was searching for a solution. In Psalm 25, you're going to learn a lot from David, and we're going to unpack it in three sections together. But as we walk through the psalm, I want you to notice a pattern. See, first, David, he's going to make a request, and then he's going to remind himself about what God is like. David's going to make a request, and the thing that he's hoping God will do, and then he's going to remind himself about God's track record. And here's what you're going to see happen. He'll make the request, God, I'm hoping you will. He's going to look at God's track record. That's what he's holding on to. And it's going to create a response in his life. It's going to change his experience of what he's going through. And notice this, that David always anchors his request to the character and track record of God. Like this in verse 1, where it says, "In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me." See, before he was king and while he was king, David was always facing enemies. This was his normal life. It's like if for you had a boss that didn't like you and was always trying to get you fired, and that became just kind of your normal life. That's what he was experiencing. And so here's his request. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. In essence, David is requesting a solution. And if I were to summarize the first couple verses, it would look like this. This is his request. God, please give me a solution. That's his request. Now, David was a great warrior, right? Not only did he defeat a giant in one-to-one combat with the whole Goliath incident, he went on to fight many more battles, and he eventually became renowned as a champion and as a general and commander. The strongest and the bravest and the craziest warriors of his day would line up to join in his army because David was the best of them all. He was so successful, they even wrote a song about him. I can't sing it to you, but one of the lyrics went like this: Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And here, David is facing an enemy, and we don't know if David's facing war from an invading other country or some kind of plot from within his own palace. But what we do know is that David has dealt with threats before, but look what he does here. Instead of relying on his past experience and expertise and ability, David turns to God and trusts in him for a solution. Now, this doesn't mean that David doesn't use his own brain. No, it means that he trusted God before and more than himself. How different is that from you and me? I find myself in frustrating situations, but instead of praying, I just start planning my way out. See, when it comes to finding solutions, we have a tendency to make God our last resort instead of our first stop. And there is a reason that David puts his hope in God, verse 3. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame, but shame will come on those who are treacherous without cause. Those who are treacherous without cause. He's comparing what he's doing to what's going on in the lives of the people around him. And he's pointing to God's track record. No one who ever hopes in you will ever be put to shame. His request was, don't let me ever be put to shame. Then the record that he's holding on to, that God has, God's MO, the way he always operates that you can count on, the record is no one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame. See that pattern? He's making a request, but then he's kind of tying it to God's track record. It would look like this if we were going to kind of put it in today's language. God's team always triumphs. And that's the truth that David is holding on to. God's team always wins in the end, always. And David is not saying, if I follow God, I'll never experience any setbacks or any loss. No, David is saying that when it comes down to it, God's way is the best way. And when we follow him, life isn't always peachy, not at all, but we will win in the end. You see, in heaven, God will settle every account. No sin will ever go unpunished. Justice will be served. And there are two ways that can happen. Either we pay the penalty or Jesus does in our place. But perfect justice will be met in the end. But it's not just in the end. Even though not everything is resolved on this side of heaven, we could see some of it. When you look at the circumstances around you, you could see some of this happening. When people go against God's direction in this life, we often see the consequences catch up to them because it never pays to disobey. When we refuse to follow God's sexual ethic, we never end up with more freedom like we're promised. We end up with the consequences and complications of going our own way. And when we reject God's plan for relationships, when he tells us to be loving and we choose instead to be selfish, our relationships and our marriages and our families, they're not stronger, they suffer. We can see it today. God's team always triumphs. In other words, you win when you bet on God. And God's team wins in the end. But we have to admit, sometimes it feels like we're losing, right? I heard a coach say this week, he said, I don't care what happens in the first half. We could be up, we could be down. The game's not over yet. And sometimes our circumstances of our lives, they make us feel like we're losing. And when that happens, we can start to panic and we can start to trust in other things more or before God. We can become fickle fans. Now, my son is the definition of a fair weather fan. In a single game, he can change who he's rooting for as many times as people score. In fact, when one team scores and gets ahead of the other one, he'll look over at me and say, okay, I'm rooting for them now. He likes to be on the winning side, don't you? He's kind of like this kid who in the middle of a game decides to switch jerseys to the other team. That's a fickle fan. And sometimes we're the same way with God. We have a fickle faith. When it looks like we're losing, we can start changing sides. You know, we'll choose to work with integrity and with character, but if the cheaters start to get ahead, we think, why don't I try some of that stuff? Because I want that promotion too. Or we'll say, well, I'm not going to gossip, but then all of a sudden you're left out of the cool crowd, and you think, well, if that's what it takes to get in, maybe I will. When it looks like we're losing, we're tempted to change sides. And David was tempted to do the same thing, but instead of switching teams, he reminds himself that God's got this. God's team always wins in the end. They triumph. And you know what that gave him? That gave him an incredible confidence to keep going on the road he was, to keep heading in the right direction, to keep going where God was leading. And it'll do the same for you. See, the first reality that we need to remember when we're trying to overcome frustration is that God's got this because God's team always triumphs. The second thing comes in verse 4. He says, show me your ways, Lord, teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long. Remember, Lord, your great mercy and love, for they are from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth and my rebellious ways. According to your love, remember me, for you, Lord, are good. Remember me according to your character, not necessarily mine. That's interesting, isn't it? David here is asking for direction from God. He's saying, show me your ways and you'll lead me in your paths. But you notice this interesting part here where he says, don't base your direction, your guidance of me on my past behavior. If I were to paraphrase what David's asking for, it would look like this. God, please guide me even though I screw up. Even though I screw up. And David is hitting on something that we all face in our relationship with God, and I have felt it too. How can I ask God for help when I screw up so much? I mean, you read the Bible in the morning, and then you get in your car to go to work, and you yell at the people in front of you that are holding you back and making you late. Like, we're hypocrites. We're hypocrites. None of us, Christian or non-Christian, lives up to the standards that we put on others. None of us. So how can we sin and then turn around and ask God, guide me, lead me, show me where to go, help me out here? I mean, is God just looking at us going, forget you? No way. With a track record like that? No. See, David is hoping that God will give him direction, but he's not trusting in his own track record to get that direction. Look instead at what he's holding on to. And as I read, because this is the longest section we're going to go through in one stretch, I want you to pay attention to all the descriptions of God and what God does, starting in verse 8. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore, he instructs sinners in his ways. He guides the humble in what is right and teaches them his way. All the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful towards those who keep the demands of his covenant. For the sake of your name, Lord, forgive my iniquity, though it is great. Who then are those who fear the Lord? He will instruct them in the ways they should choose, and they will spend their days in prosperity, and their descendants will inherit the land. The Lord confides in those who fear him. He makes his covenant known to them. My eyes are ever on the Lord, for only he will release my feet from the snare. Or in today's language, it could look something like this. God delights in directing humble sinners. See, David is always anchoring his request to the character and track record of God. And here, David describes God and his character and what he does in a lot of different ways. He says things like he's good and upright. He guides and teaches the humble. He is always loving and always faithful. But I want to draw your attention to two lines in particular. Verse 11, where it says, for the sake of your name, Lord, forgive my iniquity. Iniquity just means sin. And he says, though it is great. Verse 6, remember, Lord, your great mercy and love, for they are from of old. They are from of old means this is your track record. This is how God has always worked. This is how God has always been. This is who God is. My sin is great, but your mercy and love are greater. My grace, your grace is greater. That's God's track record. Romans 5:20 puts it powerfully when it says this, but where sin increased, grace increased all the more. Where sin increased, grace increased all the more. My sin was great, your grace was greater. That's God's track record. And David is trusting in God's grace over his fickle goodness. And that gives him a confidence that God will direct him. Remember, David always anchors his request in the character and track record of God. And God is not a genie that you make wishes to. He is a person that loves you. And as a person, he has a personality and has a character. And God always acts in line with that character. The only thing impossible for God is for him to act in a way that's contrary to his own nature. I don't boo or throw anything, but I grew up in a Ford family. Especially Ford trucks. And it didn't matter if those were like the best trucks on the road. It didn't matter because we were a Ford family. And so if we went to go buy a vehicle or a truck, it would be a Ford. And if my dad were to come home with a Chevy, we would take him to the hospital, get his head checked out, because there's no way he would do that, because it just doesn't match up with who he is. Maybe you have a friend who always comes through. Or maybe you have a spouse who always holds the door for you. And you're so used to that if they stopped doing it one day, it would be so unexpected that you would run right into the door, right? Because that's just like who they are. And as humans, we can change in our character and our personalities and preferences, but God is perfect and does not change, which means that God always holds open the door. God will always forgive. God will direct you. You can count on it because that's his character. Like we said in the first week of this series, God's not asking you to be completely sinless. He's just asking you to be completely honest. And when you're that humble, God will, without fail, direct you, because God delights in directing humble sinners. And when you realize that God is excited to and always will step into, direct you, it gives you purpose. You start living each day like a Where's Waldo game, where you're like, God's up to something, what's he doing? I know God will direct me, what's he saying? I know God's up to something, where is he talking? I know that for me, that when the pressure's on in my life and I start to lean into God, it's amazing to me how everything I read, every comment someone makes, every Facebook post, every word of encouragement, every verse that pops up seems to kind of direct me in the way that I should go, as this message that God brings around me and directs my life if I'm humble enough to look for him. See, when you're searching for a solution to your frustration, you need to remember, God's got this. God's team always triumphs. And God delights in directing humble sinners. He's got this. He's got you. He'll see you through. One last reality that gives us confidence that God's got this is in verse 16, where he writes, turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and free me from my anguish. Look on my affliction and distress. Take away all of my sins. See how numerous are my enemies and how fiercely they hate me. See, David is asking for a resolution here, an end to this tough circumstance. That's what David is requesting. Relieve the troubles of my heart and free me from my anguish. David is saying, this is wearing me out. I don't know how much more I can endure. But listen to the words that he uses and asking God to fix these things. He says things like, God, please step in, please step in. Turn to me and be gracious to me. Free me, look upon and take away and see how and guard and rescue me and let me not be put to shame. He's pleading again and again for God to step in and do something. If we were to summarize it, we'd say, he's saying, God, please free me from this frustration. Please give me a way out. I'm overwhelmed. Please just give me some relief. His frustration has grown, and it's grown, and it's grown, and he doesn't know if he can take it anymore. Do you? You feel like you can't take it anymore? He just wants some relief. But then he says this in verse 20. Guard my life and rescue me. Do not let me be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. May integrity and uprightness protect me, because my hope, Lord, is in you. Deliver Israel, O God, from all of their troubles. See, David really wants to be free from frustration, but he's learned something through this struggle. He's learned that God's got this. See, even when things are at their most difficult, God is a refuge and protection. God is my protection. This conclusion is fascinating because we don't get to the end of the psalm and David says, hey, I prayed and God fixed everything. Interesting. Doesn't get to the end of the psalm and everything's all tied up neatly. No, he gets to the end of the psalm and he doesn't say God removed everything. He says God is my refuge. He is my protection. And to understand David's insight, I think we need to think about some of the best action movies of all time. Of course, I'm talking about Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise. And one of the movies, Ghost Protocol, takes place in Dubai. And one of the best action scenes in that movie involves Ethan Hunt, our hero, chasing the bad guys through a sandstorm. Now, these sandstorms are real. They happen in Dubai. They can happen multiple times a year. And when they blow in, the temperature rises and it whips these little tornadoes up in the streets. And eventually these huge walls of sand blast through the city. As a result of the low visibility, there are hundreds of car wrecks each time. Things left outside are damaged, and authorities encourage people to, get inside to find a refuge. Understandably, one of the things that authorities kind of warn against is eating any food from any outdoor cafes. Now, Dubai is a beautiful city. It's one of the top 5 most visited cities in the world. And imagine you get to visit Dubai and you want to sit outside and enjoy this wonderful meal like these fine folks. But then a sandstorm rolls in, it ruins all of your plans. And here's the thing, even if you cannot eat outside, you could still eat inside. And it might be even better if you get to eat at a place like Oceanos, which is Dubai's underwater restaurant. Woo, that's pretty cool. Here's what David learned. Sure, he can't control the circumstances. He can't wave his hand and make the constant conflict and overwhelming frustrations disappear. He cannot control the storm, but God is the refuge and protection in the storm. And even though there's a storm raging outside in his life, he can still go to God and enjoy a meal inside. When life is full of frustration, you can go to God and find some protection. And at that time, when you're with God, when you meet with him, like an oasis or like a refuge from the storm, you will find your confidence in him growing, your purpose enlarging, and peace settling in your soul. It brings peace. Yes, David wants God to fix things, but in the meantime, he constantly comes back to this truth that God's got this. And while frustration can lead to lives of quiet desperation, where it's not so bad that everyone notices, but you and I know how it feels, how tortured you can be, how much you wonder God's gonna allow this, and how long is this gonna go on, and I don't think I can take any more. Even though that frustration can build and build and build so that we're leading lives of quiet desperation. Leaning into God in these times can create a very real spiritual resurrection inside of you. And so when you're searching for a solution to the frustration, you gotta remember, God's got this. God's team always triumphs, so I'm gonna stick with him. I'm gonna put my hope in him. God delights in directing humble sinners, so I'm gonna look for him because he's gonna guide me. And God is my protection. When I don't feel like I can take it anymore, I can take some time with God, and it will help me find some peace. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home and I want you to fill in these blanks. Fill in the request, God's track record, and then see what the response is as you focus on those things. I want you to write down what's frustrating you, to actually write down what's bothering you, to write it down as a request. Like, God, I need to change, and I can't seem to change. God, I want to overcome this sin. God, I want to win in my finances, but I can't seem to make it work or get ahead. God, I want to stop worrying so much. It just dominates my life. God, I don't want to hate my job. And just write it down as a request. God, please, please help with this. And then write down God's track record. You can write down God's track record in your life, the way that he's come through for you again and again. But maybe even more helpful is to step back and to look at the Bible and just see, because it's kind of easier to see in someone else's life, how God comes through again and again and again. And you see who he is, and you anchor your hope in the character of God. And so you'd write things in here like, God's in the business of changing people like me. That's what he loves to do. Or God will help me win over sin. That's the promise. Or God will always provide. I can count on it. And God guides those who ask. He gives wisdom freely to anyone who asks. So, and as you trust in God in this way, you make your request, you look at his track record, there's a change in your experience. You will grow in confidence and in purpose and in peace. And to help you hold on to this truth in your own life so that you do truly, after you leave this place, find confidence and purpose and peace, we have a gift that we'd like to give you as you head out the doors today. It's a wristband. And on it says, God's got this. God's got this. And I want you to take it and wear it or put it where you're going to see it so that in the normal grind of life, through the frustration and the short-lived satisfaction, you'll have this reminder, no matter what you're facing, that God's got this. And when you wonder, really? Really? God's got this? Are you sure? Do you know what I'm facing? The thing that I can't ever beat, the thing that I've never been able to overcome, really? God is going to take this mess and make something incredible out of it? Really? God's got this? Romans 8:28 tells us. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That's us. All things, nothing left out. God is working on it. God's got this. And so I want you to take a wristband as you leave today. Put it where you can see it. And when the frustration starts to build up in your life, and you're afraid that God's not going to show up or come through for you, I want you to look at it and say, God's got this. God's got this. He's got it. As the band comes back up for a final song, I want to point out that on that first Christmas, when it was just right on the horizon, an angel appeared to Joseph in his dream, and he told him one of the names that would be Jesus' name that would tell us what he's like and what he came to do. And that name that he gave him was Emmanuel, which means God with us. God with us. That's the promise of Christmas. God with us, really, truly, and wholeheartedly with us. You see, when God shows up, it will change your life. And the question our hearts are always asking is, will God come through? And will God answer my prayer? And will God show up? And the answer of Christmas is that he already has. See, the baby in Bethlehem was just the beginning of God proving that he was here with us. Now his Spirit is inside of us, and he's not going anywhere. God has shown up, and if you'll turn to him when you fall short, and if you'll turn to him when you feel the pressure, and if you'll turn to him when you are alone, and when you turn to him when you are searching, you will discover that God is with us and God's got this.